high-powered CEO trading his suit for stones, only for a sudden accident to shatter the peace. Is their mountain dream collapsing? Hi everyone, hope you're having a great day. Today, we'll explore a story of intense pressure and hidden sanctuary. If you enjoy this journey, don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss our next episodes. The morning light in the city always carries a sense of suffocating urgency. Inside the vast executive office on the top floor of the corporate headquarters, CEO Quang was facing a morning that was anything but easy. The low hum of the air conditioner wasn't enough to cool the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. On his desk, thick stacks of files, financial charts with downward trending lines, and the constant ping of notifications created an invisible chaos. The emergency meeting had been grueling since 8 a.m. Shareholders and the board of directors were locked in a heated debate over a new niche project the company was launching. Quang sat at the head of the table, maintaining his usual stoic executive demeanor, but his hands, clenched tightly under the table, betrayed the exhaustion gnawing at his soul. Questions about profit margins, risk assessments, and even whispered rumors about his personal life began to surface. In this position that thousands envied, Quang understood that every step he took was under a microscope, especially now, as he spent more time with a mountain girl like Linda, something his family viewed as a dangerous deviation from his career trajectory. CEO, we need a definitive answer on the budget allocation for this niche market. An older director spoke up, jarring Quang from his thoughts. He cleared his throat, using his professional grit to pull the meeting back on track. But his mind was drifting toward that distant mountain, where the smell of damp earth and the sound of birds filled the garden behind Linda's house. He wondered if she was upset about his sudden departure the other day. Had the vegetable seeds they planted together begun to sprout yet? The meeting dragged on past noon. When the room finally cleared, Quang remained seated, removing his glasses to rub his aching temples. The stress of being a CEO wasn't just about the numbers. It was the weight of living up to everyone else's expectations. He picked up his phone, intending to text Linda, but then hesitated. He wanted to surprise her. More importantly, he needed to escape. Without a word to his assistant or a glance at his missed calls, Quang grabbed his car keys and left the building. His luxury car sped away, leaving behind the skyscrapers and the cacophony of sirens, heading straight for the misty blue peaks on the horizon. After more than 2 hours of driving, the atmosphere began to shift. The urban roar was replaced by the sound of wind rushing through pine trees and the earthy scent of wild grass. By the time Quang pulled up in front of Linda's gate, the sun had begun its late afternoon descent. The waning sunlight cast a layer of golden honey over the small garden. Linda was out back, busy with bamboo stakes and a pile of river stones. Seeing Quang appear with his expensive white shirt wrinkled and dark circles under his eyes, Linda didn't ask many questions. She simply smiled and handed him a ladle of cool water. Her silent understanding at that moment was more precious than any words of comfort could ever be. Quang shed his high-end shirt, swapping it for an old t-shirt he had left there previously. He rolled up his sleeves, took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air, and felt the heavy stones in his heart lift. He looked at Linda and asked about her plans for the afternoon. Linda pointed to an open patch of land facing the valley. I want to build a small stone house here, just a tiny shelter for when it rains while I'm gardening, or a place for us to sit and have tea every morning. That idea immediately sparked a fire in Quang. Building a home, even if it was just a stone shack, felt infinitely more meaningful than constructing multi-million-dollar projects in the city. And so, they set to work. This project was entirely manual. There were no machines, no complex blueprints, just raw strength and persistence. Quang began gathering large stones from near the stream and the hillside. The stones were heavy, jagged, and covered in moss. The CEO, usually accustomed to holding a pen and directing others, was now straining to carry massive boulders. Sweat began to soak through his shirt and cling to his forehead, but strangely, Quang didn't feel tired. On the contrary, the feeling of manual labor, of touching the most primal elements of the earth, made him feel truly alive. Linda was equally determined. Though slender, she was incredibly resilient. She chose smaller stones to wedge into the gaps, skillfully arranging them so the stone wall grew sturdy. They worked in a rhythmic harmony, occasionally catching each other's gaze and sharing a smile. Every stone placed felt like a promise, a bridge between two souls from two vastly different worlds. The stories of the stressful morning meeting faded into the background, replaced by the mountain breeze and the rhythmic clinking of stone against stone. The small house slowly began to take shape, starting with the foundation and the first few layers of the wall. It possessed a raw, rustic beauty that blended perfectly with the surrounding landscape. Quang, while hauling a large rock toward the wall, remarked, "You know, in the city, people use money to buy living space. Here, we use our sweat to create it. This feeling is truly different." Linda paused, wiping a bead of sweat from her cheek, her eyes sparkling with joy. "Because this house has our soul in it, Quang." But life is rarely composed of only peaceful moments. As the stone wall rose to waist height, their excitement led to a brief moment of carelessness. Linda wanted to place a uniquely shaped stone at the corner to create a focal point. The rock was quite heavy and had sharp edges. She strained to lift it, her small hands trembling slightly from the fatigue of a long afternoon of labor. Quang, at that moment, had his back turned to gather more of their homemade mortar and couldn't reach her in time. "Linda, be careful!" Quang suddenly turned and shouted as he saw the stone begin to tilt in her grasp, but it was too late. Losing her footing, the stone slipped from Linda's grip and fell with immense force. A dull, heavy thud echoed through the garden, followed immediately by Linda's piercing cry of pain. The heavy rock had landed squarely on her foot before rolling aside. Linda collapsed to the ground, her face turning pale as the sudden wave of agony hit her. Quang lunged toward her like an arrow. All the composure of a high-powered CEO vanished instantly, replaced by sheer terror. He dropped to his knees, his hands shaking as he touched Linda's leg. "Linda, are you okay? Let me see." His voice broke with panic. Seeing the wound starting to swell and bleed on her fair foot, Quang felt his chest tighten. Her pain seemed to vibrate directly into his own heart, hurting him more than any business failure ever could. The peaceful atmosphere of the late afternoon was suddenly shattered by this heart-wrenching accident. Amidst the scattered stones of their unfinished home, would their love be sturdy enough to overcome the physical injury and the storms looming ahead? The silence that followed Linda's cry was deafening, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of two people caught in a moment of pure crisis. Quang's world, which usually revolved around market fluctuations and corporate strategy, had shrunk down to the size of a bruised and bleeding foot. He didn't think, he simply acted. With a gentleness that contradicted his panicked expression, he lifted the heavy stone away and tossed it aside as if it weighed nothing. He gathered Linda into his arms, feeling her body tremble against his chest. The smell of the earth and the scent of her hair, which had been so soothing just moments ago, now felt heavy with the weight of his guilt. "I've got you, Linda. I've got you," he whispered, more to convince himself than her. He carried her to the wooden porch of her small house, setting her down on the bench with the utmost care. His mind was racing. In the boardroom, he always had a contingency plan, a backup strategy for every niche market failure. But here, with the sun dipping below the horizon and the nearest hospital miles away, he felt stripped of his power. He rushed inside, returning with a basin of cool spring water and clean cloth. As he knelt at her feet, his expensive trousers staining with dirt, he didn't care. He carefully washed the blood and dust away, his eyes never leaving the wound. Every time Linda winced, Quang felt a sharp pang in his own gut. Linda looked down at the man kneeling before her. This was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar corporation, a man who gave orders to hundreds of people, now trembling as he bandaged a girl's foot in the middle of nowhere. "Quang, it's just a scratch. I'll be fine," she said softly, though her voice still carried the strain of the pain. She reached out and touched his shoulder, trying to steady him. Quang looked up, his eyes glassy. "It's not just a scratch, Linda. We were building something beautiful, and I let you get hurt. I was so caught up in the work, just like I am in the city." The vulnerability in his voice was raw. For the first time, he wasn't the CEO. He was just a man who realized how much he stood to lose. As the evening settled in, the mountain air grew chilly. Quang insisted on finishing the first aid, wrapping her foot with a precision that surprised even himself. He then went back out to the garden. He didn't continue building the wall. Instead, he gathered all the tools, covered the piles of stones with a tarp, and made sure everything was secure. He realized then that a house isn't built in a day, and a life together isn't just about the moments of triumph. It's about how you handle the collapses. When he returned to the porch, he brought 2 mugs of steaming herbal tea. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the stars begin to pierce through the darkening sky. "The board of directors wants me back tomorrow," Quang said suddenly, his voice low. "There's another emergency meeting regarding the niche project's expansion. And my mother, she's sent more than 20 messages today." He looked at his phone, the screen glowing like a harsh reminder of a reality he wanted to forget. The contrast was staggering. Here, there was the smell of wood smoke and the quiet resilience of a girl who built her life from the ground up. There, it was a cold, calculated game of chess where everyone was a pawn. Linda leaned her head on his shoulder, her injured foot propped up on a stool. "Do you have to go?" she asked, not as a demand, but as a quiet inquiry into his heart. Quang sighed, the weight of his responsibilities settling back onto his shoulders. "I have to finish what I started there. If I don't, I'll never be truly free to stay here. But seeing you like this, it makes the city feel like a prison." He realized that the home they were building wasn't just the stone structure in the garden. It was the space they created for each other, away from the expectations of the world. However, the peace was shattered by the insistent ringing of his phone. It wasn't a message this time. It was a direct call from his father. Quang hesitated, the blue light of the screen illuminating the conflict on his face. He walked to the edge of the porch to take the call. Linda couldn't hear the words, but she could hear the tone, stern, commanding, and cold. She saw Quang's back stiffen, his executive posture returning out of habit. When he hung up, he didn't turn around immediately. He stood looking out into the dark valley for a long minute. "They found out I'm here," he said, turning back to her. His face was a mask of weary determination. "Someone followed me. They're using you, as leverage against my position in the company. They think you're a distraction, a weakness in our niche strategy." He walked back to her and took her hands in his. "I have to go back and settle this once and for all. If I don't face them now, they'll never stop coming for what we have." The romantic dream of the afternoon felt suddenly fragile, like the unfinished stone wall sitting in the dark. Linda felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the night air. She realized that their little sanctuary was no longer a secret. The city, with all its power and malice, had finally reached the mountain. "Will you come back?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Quang leaned in and kissed her forehead, a gesture of deep reverence and promise. "I'll be back on Saturday. I'll finish that wall, and I'll make sure no one ever gets hurt in this garden again. Not you, and not us." He helped her inside, making sure she had everything she needed within reach. As he walked toward his car, he looked back at the unfinished stone house. It looked like a ruin in the moonlight, but to him, it was a foundation. As the engine roared to life, the headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the path back to the world of glass and steel. Quang's grip on the steering wheel was firm. He was no longer the exhausted CEO running away. He was a man going to war for the only thing that felt real. But as the red taillights faded into the distance, Linda sat by the window, clutching her bandaged foot. She knew that the stones they had piled today were just the beginning. The real weight was yet to come, and the mountain felt larger and lonelier than it ever had before.
Linda theo bà và cậu cháu ra nương mía. Dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà